Today, we are very excited to host this next version of the Leadership Speaker Series. Today, we have the Chief Product and Technology Officer of Tumblr here with us, Lance Willett. Lance, great to connect with you and really appreciate you taking time to speak with us today about leadership, growing your career, working remotely, hiring, building organizations. So I'm really excited about talking to you. And why don't you also just introduce yourself a little bit to all of our guests and people who are watching this.
Thank you, Deepak and Turing.com for having me. I am a hybrid designer developer. I started out building websites, and that led me to WordPress, which was the early start of my tech career. This is about 2009 or 2010, building WordPress themes, but going from that environment where I was working on 1 or 2 client sites at a time to launching a theme that anyone in the world could download. And that was a pretty big step change for me, but also really helped me sharpen my skills, right? Rather than solving one point problem, I'm now solving big picture problems. And so that's a key point of my story is WordPress themes and global scale. And really, I hope that we can talk about this, but building not just products for people everywhere, but companies that are for everyone in the world, right? That are opportunities are everywhere, right? And talented people everywhere. So that's really the origin story is I got into Automatic, and that's the company that's the owner of WordPress.com. For those that aren't familiar, it's sort of the for-profit side of the equation. So there's WordPress.org, which is a downloadable, free and open source software. And we also have the SaaS version, which is a hosted version of WordPress, which is what I have been working on since that time. And we share a co-founder, right? Matt Mullenweg is a co-founder of WordPress, and he started Automatic as a way to build a for-profit company. And since then, we've grown, many different products, WooCommerce for e-commerce and stores, and Tumblr, which is what I'm working on today, which is more of a social media blogging platform. But there's a thread, right, which is, open source software, web publishing at scale. And I think of it as tools for anyone, anyone from any background, any country, any language, any gender, any financial background to be able to publish and get their story out, right? So it could be a website, it could be a store to sell things, or it could be more of the fun. Tumblr is more the fun and the weird and the wacky part of that. And I really enjoy working on that. And that's my day job today.
That is fantastic. By the way, Lance, one of the things that I found really inspiring about your background is that you have lived in many countries in your life. You grew up in many countries, you also currently are located in Arizona, I believe, in Tucson, and leading an incredible tech team, engineering, data science, and product globally. Tell me, how did you make that happen? Because something like that would have been very hard to do. Like I would like to think, like a few years ago. How have things changed? How have you made it happen?
This is a great topic, especially now that we've been forced to do this, right, with the pandemic. Previous to 2020, we would go out and evangelize, right? So I mentioned Matt, the co-founder of WordPress and now the Automatic CEO. He has a whole podcast and blog around this called distributed.blog. And we were making a very pointed effort to talk to folks of any tech company, really any organization, to say, hey, this is the right way to work. And we can get into the details, but he has a very important blog post about the levels of autonomy in a distributed company, where you, at certain levels, you just replicate what you had in the office. Then as you go up towards the ideal state, you take advantage, right? So rather than just being like a version of it, it's more powerful, more effective. For me, the roots of it are in open source software. And so this is the story of WordPress as well, and how we started Automatic. Right before I joined, I was probably employee 45 or 50. And now the entire organization is about almost 2,000 people. So it's a large organization now. And the roots in the open source, movement were the tool, right? The code. It wasn't necessarily about who you were, even what you looked like. Many times we knew each other by our handle, IRC handle, or GitHub, or whatever tool we were using to collaborate and contribute. I would know people's usernames before I even knew their real name or where they lived. And so my introduction to this world was downloading tools that I needed. I mentioned earlier working on websites for clients. So at one point I needed a gallery, like a WordPress, sorry, before even WordPress, a PHP gallery. And I had found this, of course, free because I was on a lean budget. I found the open source tool and I download it, but pretty soon I also want to, contribute a bug fix back. Oh, there's a typo, or, oh, I thought of a new way to do the index view or something. So early on, I would, whether it was email or a patch, at that time we used Subversion and Track. I don't know if that, Deepak, if you remember those tools.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. And it feels like dinosaur sometimes looking at it now, right? It's outdated, but some of those tools are still in place and they're very effective. But what I would do is I would submit my change or my request, but then you start to poke around a little bit. Who else is involved, right? So then you develop a relationship, and it's often over a distance. You don't necessarily meet up unless you know who they are and you're in the same physical location. So I mentioned that because this is how our company was formed. We didn't necessarily go and all move to San Francisco or go and all move to New York. When we joined as employees, we lived where we already were. And so from day one, Automatic was built to mimic that sort of open source, people from anywhere, smart, dedicated people who care about the same problem or the same solution, but not necessarily people who have all the same background or the same college degree or have any other really, what we would consider to be titles or pedigree on the wall, right? Like a diploma or something. It was more about what they were interested in doing. So we've been able to establish the company, and this is Automatic, the for-profit side, in the same way. So we never had an office. We've had a lounge in San Francisco. Tumblr has had an office in New York, which we're turning into more of a co-working now. But we put the emphasis on, people's contributions. We put the emphasis on what skills they could bring to the team, design, development, project management, business, rather than do you live in the Bay Area, rather than, did you go to an Ivy League college or university? So that was really important in the beginning to establish that the value here is in the person's contribution rather than what they look like or what background. And just to answer your point about growing up outside the US, I was born in Mexico City, and I moved all around Mexico with my parents who were doing linguistic work. And I quickly realized that a lot of their contributions, they would work with people in Germany, Spain, Peru, South Africa, without necessarily seeing them over email or other services. And so this was role modeled, by my parents, that maybe they would go to a conference once a year, right? And have like a paper, they would deliver a paper from the stage. But 99% of their work was just using, written tools, typing things out to each other in files and sending them. And so it's a very similar approach to this distributed company where the work and sort of the outcome of what the work that you do, the productive part of it, is what shines rather than who the people are or where they live.
I love it. I think focus more on the outcome rather than where people live or like the more of the activity part. But if you focus on that, then right things will happen, and that could be like an impetus for going remote and leveraging some of the talent all over the world that you were talking about. So I feel like you are like in a great, fantastic place right now with Automatic, where some of your experiences, even in the past, with like open source and how you grew up, as well as there seems like a very really good match with Automatic. A lot of companies might not be born with that DNA to begin with, right? Any advice you would have for somebody who might be thinking about going remote in companies that have maybe traditionally not been remote? Any advice, things that you feel could be different in the two environments, things to take note for a more traditional company or manager?
Yes, and as I mentioned, we're being forced into this, right, in the last 2 years. So it's very important to talk about. And of course, there are different flavors, right? You might have teams that are completely remote and distributed that might rely, in our case, we relied on travel when we were able to get together. And we would have kickoffs, we would have inviting new team members, a company meeting. So we weren't 100% isolated, right? We had these periods where we would come together, and then we would take that back with us and back to our home office or wherever we work. So one misconception to get out of the way is that it's 100%, one person in a private room, right? It's not really like that. What the point is that we would shift away from needing to be in a central day-to-day, right? Where we would still get together. I would recommend, though, to companies who are exploring the shift from this hybrid, where you kind of one day in the office, I don't really know who's going to be there. Do we need to explore? Can I move? To like the 100%, right? So if you're trying to shift between those two modes, really think about what are the key habits, right? Going back to first principles of communication, documentation, how you share things. Do you rely on, say, like an all hands meeting in the lunchroom on a Friday? Or is it something where you have a wiki? Or in our case, we have a blogging tool, right? Or WordPress, we use blogs, where someone could write a memo and everyone else can see, right? So I would suggest going back to some of those first principles around, for me, it comes back to asynchronous communication versus relying on meetings. So in a way that's digestible. By the way, talking about cross-cultural, if you have teams where their native language isn't English, this actually comes into play for understanding and for communicating clearly. If they have something they can read at their own pace versus having to very quickly on a video chat respond, it helps with that inclusivity, right? So there's some good side effects here. And one example of what we do at Automatic for this is if we do have an all hands, like we call it a town hall, where the CEO is talking to the entire company, we do captions, if the tool like Zoom or Google Meet allows that, but we also do a full transcript. And it benefits not just the moment, right? Where you're saying, I missed something, or what was that acronym? I need to look that up, which happens to me frequently, even though I've been here a while. It also benefits later, right? And this is going back to that clear documentation or inclusivity. It doesn't just benefit someone who wasn't present because maybe a time zone got shifted or something. It's also the future us when we need to remember a decision or when we need to refresh our memory. We can go back to that record and search it, right? So in our case, we have a searchable archive of all the decisions, all the things that have happened at the company. That's so valuable. So again, going back to the first principles around how are you communicating things? Is it all sort of ephemeral and in a meeting? How much are you writing down? And then we can go into other topics, but there's things like hiring and onboarding. There's things like, when someone switches from an individual track to a manager track, how do you enable them in this environment? And then how do you figure out key relationships, right? Partnerships, investors, board meetings, right? All the business processes. How do you solve those? And I think that there are creative ways to do it. And by the way, there are other companies doing this. So very recently, GitLab went public, and their IPO to me is a really monumental thing to talk about because they're also a fully distributed company.
Absolutely, yeah. GitLab is a great example. How people are building these companies that are like remote, and GitLab was remote even before before COVID, before like this new shift to remote happened. So I think something to really think deeply about, like how successful companies are being founded in a remote first world. You mentioned something I would love to dig a little bit deeper into, like hiring and onboarding, right? How is hiring and onboarding different in a remote first environment than a more traditional environment for you? And how do you do it?
So I have a different answer now than pre-pandemic, right? Pre-pandemic, when travel was allowed, we would very frequently try to get a new person to meet other people quickly. There's a couple ways to do it. One would be geographically, if they're in a place where other Automatic employees live, go to lunch, right? Or have coffee or co-working. The second way to do it would be if there were a team already traveling for a meetup, just join that team and you get to soak in a little bit of the culture. You get to work together on a project. Now, because we don't have that right now, we have to be creative, right? And so one of the themes here in this whole philosophy is you have to be creative and you have to be innovative. So you can't just take a playbook from Google or a playbook from GitLab or even from Automatic and just directly apply. You have to be creative in how you tailor it, right, to your situation. So for example, you might have 3 people in Berlin, Germany, and the 4th person that's coming on board. Oh, they're also in Berlin. I'd like to introduce you to, right? And you connect them together. They might invite them out to something in physical location. The other thing around hiring and onboarding is a little bit of structure. So in our case, we have different mechanisms that weave together an onboarding experience for the new employee. This includes, going back to documentation, we have a field guide, which is basically like a boot camp. Like, go read these 3 pages, and like a security to setting up your computer, how to file your expenses, all the things that a new employee needs to do logistically. That's all written down and they can pace themselves. We also have a habit where every new employee goes through 2 weeks of customer support where they're doing frontline support for their product. So on Tumblr, before someone can start, even a C-suite executive, right, has to do this as well. And I believe it's a good impact later. But you're learning the product, you're learning how customers are dealing with pain points, and you're also learning, where do I go to look up answers? Because in this culture, a lot of it is self-serve. We don't always have people, if they're on a different time zone, I can't get an immediate reply. I have to know where to go look. So that's another thing we do in the first 2 weeks. After that, we structure things into the team lead or manager, the HR team, and mentors and buddies. And so we kind of have this combination of a team approach where the team lead might have some onboarding to the team or the product, right? So, okay, here's your teammates. If you're an Android developer, here's how we deploy code. Here's the tools. The HR team may run them through, here are the perks, here are the learning and development, professional development, coaching things that we have available. And then there's going to be a mentor or a buddy, and that's usually someone not on their team. And so the mentor might be someone who is like me, right, who's been at the company longer and can then provide some guidance, direct guidance. Like, reach out to me anytime if you run into or don't know where to ask the question, come to me. The buddy is a little bit different. The buddy is usually a peer or someone who's in a similar situation. So just to give an example, say 6 people join the same day, we're going to put them into a cohort. We call it a culture cohort. And they get to go through some of those exercises together, and they're helping each other. And then there would be someone like me, maybe checking in once a week over the first 6 weeks. Did you have any questions? What's been the most surprising thing? The purpose of all this structure is to say, yes, you do need to figure some of it out, right? You have to know where to go with self-serve, but you also want someone that you can reach out to, right? So you have your team lead, HR, buddy, mentor, and it provides this nice, group of people to go to. Now, beyond, as people get into their career, there may be other mechanisms, right? Conferences, books, everyone working at JavaScript should go to this thing, right? That kind of thing. And then we also might later on talk about what are some of the non-work ways to get connected, right? Employee resource group or something like that, where it's around hobbies or affinity. We also have that. And we don't usually introduce that straight away because it can be overwhelming, right? Here's 200 options. But we do take a structured approach. And I think the other important thing is making the person feel welcome, even if you can't, shake their hand or give them a hug or high five. And that's, again, it takes creativity. It takes things like Zoom. It takes things like maybe sending a care package that they get in the mail with some swag. So it's fun.
That sounds great. What have you encountered any difference in managing a team that is globally distributed versus a distributed team that is like living in the same city, country, or culture? Right? Any thoughts on that?
Yep. Now, I will say first, many of the issues are the same, right? We're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with software. We're dealing with bugs and customers, right? And shipping things. So many of the topics, or let's call it the themes that you might approach a conversation or a one-on-one or training or development, it's going to be very similar, right? The topics. So let's talk about what the differences might be. One is that when you have a kickoff or something brand new, it's usually really nice to do that together, right? Post-it notes, up on the wall, whiteboarding, maybe even walking around and visiting client, depending on the type of business, you might want to go visit the people you're working with and see their physical plant or see their store. So I think that's harder to do when you're not on site. So one of the tactics or techniques we take on this is we try to have those insights, right, that are coming out of those interactions shared very quickly and openly. So one person may have been in London and was able to go on site to the client. Well, can they please share a quick report, right? That like a video or bullet points, something that helps other people get up to speed quickly. So I want to go back to this principle of communication. And for us, it's a little bit of over communication. We have this public creed, the automatic creed, and one of the lines in there says, communication is oxygen. And what we mean by that is the more that we do of it, the healthier the organism. And without it, right, things shrivel or things don't work as well. And so part of that oxygen is anyone who's at the outside of the organization, customer support, salespeople, maybe even the CEO, right, who's seeing things that the rest of us don't see. They have a habit of sharing those very frequently and transparently. So rather than just going into a meeting and talking to two people, they might write it down and share it with the whole company and say, guess what? I just talked to our customer and here's the 3 things they want us to change. And so the habit of writing that down and sharing that openly is really important for this distributed, because then it's available to you at the time that you choose to consume it, rather than I wasn't awake at 1 a.m. when they were having that thing because I live in Singapore, right? That's one of the principles. Another thing I want to mention is that the intentionality around time zones and cultural backgrounds, and just because we're a global team, and I'm sure other teams have dealt with this as well, even co-located, right? You might have people from different backgrounds and styles, is that you might want to design a how we work, almost like a charter or a what's another word for this? Like an operating system, team OS. That basically says, here are some of the agreements that we have. When we have a conflict, we're going to use these tools. When we have a goal setting exercise, here's how we do that. When we're doing yearly planning, here's how we do that, right? And this can go from everything from HR conversations around performance and career development, all the way to A/B testing and product launches and marketing briefs and that kind of thing. Whatever it is that you're dealing with, and have that very clearly posted. So each team in Automatic, and Tumblr is the same. We might have a blog or a plate. You can think of it like a wiki, where we put, here's our 3-year plan, here's our product goals, here's our metrics. But guess what? Over here is our team OS. Here's where we report out to the board. Here's what's expected of you as a team member, right? Your contributions. And the principle to me is that the more clear those expectations are, right, and easily accessible and editable, right, because they're a living document, the easier it is for you to know as someone who's not in the room, who's not physically there, what's needed for you, when to do it, and have some measure of autonomy, right? It's not, many of these charters or team operating system are designed to evolve, right? So if something isn't working, and I described to you, I joined at early stage. We're at the startup stage where every week we would email the CEO on Thursday, right? Each team member. That quickly didn't scale, right? Then we got to another point of maybe 100 or 200. Same thing, things broke again. Now we're seeing that some of our systems, again, we're hiring more and more people. So even the things I'm telling you today, if we talk a year from now, right, may have evolved more.
Sounds great. That sounds fantastic. A lot of the tips that you're sharing, I think, will be very, very useful to the listeners and people who are viewing this in terms of as they start to think about some of these things. A different take to this is like, what about like personal bonds, right? Although we go to work, but like, people form these bonds, like, and sometimes we might think that it's easier to form those when you're in like the same office setting or at least in the same region or something like that. How do you build something like that in a distributed remote setting?
Yep. I love this topic because I think it's underappreciated, some of the human side of leadership. We often talk about products or technology, right? But behind that computer is a living, breathing person. So I can share some tips and techniques that have worked really well for me. And this is just my view, right? I'm sure I would love to hear from other people on this. One of the most important things is, especially when you don't have that travel, right? Where you sit down and have a meal and ask about their family. Do they have pets? Do they like sports? What's the person behind the name? Going back to the username, right? There's a human being, there's a life. So one thing that I do right away is I start a small file, and this is me as the manager. And as I'm talking to them and starting to interact, I just take notes. It seems simple, but what's interesting about it is over time it compounds. I get this, more complete picture of the person. And so maybe if I'm going into a one-on-one or a team meeting with them, I can have that in front of me and say, oh yeah, they really like coffee. We should talk about the latest, decaf trends, AeroPress versus drip or whatever, And what happens there is rather than just having a purely transactional, bits and bytes, yes and no, you start to develop these other parts of the relationship, which to me are very important. And it also impacts our business because you might find out something about someone on the team that has a direct value to the thing you're approaching, right? You might realize that they have a cousin or a parent in the industry that you're targeting, for example, if it's a new business line. Or you might realize they're geographically close to one of the clients, going back to my point about that. And so if you don't take time to explore those personal, again, who the person is, you lose out on that opportunity. Some other tactical things, this is just Tumblr. We do a lot of fun things around non-work activities that we can translate to Zoom or online, especially because we're not together. So we do a weekly cafe where it's just show up and talk. Doesn't have to be work related. We also do DJ. Someone might just play some music and people can put it on, and they might not have their video on, but they're listening and interacting and maybe suggesting songs. Like we put out a Spotify list of all the things we're listening to on Tumblr, right? And it comes out of those DJ sessions. We also do fun things like escape room, or hasn't happened yet, but we're going to do this mystery, like where each person plays a different role in like a murder mystery, and then we meet up and discuss it in character on Zoom. So creative, fun stuff. But the point is that you want to have a variety of things, right? Some people hate having the video on one more hour at the end of their day. They're not going to come to that. They might rather just play a video game and just be, tell me your username, or the version of this might be a Peloton, right? Like, tell me your Peloton name. Let's meet up when we're exercising, something like that. But at the end of the day, I think it's about making those personal connections in any way that you can. And then reminding people that if you're the manager, reminding them that you care about them and that you are paying attention to those details.
That is excellent. Your team sounds like a lot of fun. One question that I have is that you're leading a lot of different functions. You're leading product management, data science, design, engineering. Do you see like similar principles apply to all the different functions? Specifically, I'm interested in like engineering versus non-engineering, like for hiring and management of engineering. Do you deploy any different methods or techniques, or do you think like they usually cut across pretty well for all types of teams?
There are some differences. I would say general, especially on the people management side, that's going to be very similar, right? Where the differences are around technical topics, right? How you might manage a technical team, where especially if the people on the team are, highly focused on a particular tool or particular, environment, ecosystem, if you will, where you have to almost be like an evangelist, right? Or you have to, write interesting blog posts for the external world for that particular sector. That's different, right? It's a different mindset. One thing that we do is we look for, if someone is going to be a technical lead, right? And by the way, we sometimes split that out from manager. Someone could be a technical leader on an individual track as well, right? Principal, staff, fellow. We love that as well. It's very welcome, and we don't force that to advance or succeed. You don't have to be a manager. So I just want to make that clear. But one of the interesting things we do around, very specifically for engineering management, is we talk about the developer experience, right? So how do you, as an individual engineer, approach your work? Do you have the right tools? Do you have the right learning opportunities? Do you have mentors? Going back to the idea that you have these various, ways to get help. Sometimes you just want to talk to someone else and pair program and someone who's done it before, right? And so we try to set up very consciously those relationships, and they take different forms. But one form that we have really developed over the years is what we call DevX, or developer experience. And now it's a program, right? At the size of our company, it's a whole separate team, a whole separate part of the organization. And they get involved from hiring, they get involved in onboarding, and they get involved in ongoing work. And one example of this might be removing friction from deploying code, right? So interviewing people about, the continuous integration or the test environment, or even the IDE and tools that they have on their machine, right? Like going down to a very granular level and just doing a survey or doing chats or doing interviews and saying, what are the pain points for you across the whole org, pattern matching and saying, okay, we need to make an improvement there. So I mentioned Subversion earlier. Well, we've been adopting Git for many years. And one of the pain points for new developers that they join now that grew up only on Git, right? Only using GitHub, only using those tools. They don't know about Mercurial or Subversion or CVS, all the other things that we had before. And so the developer experience for those new employees is different than someone who's used to the tools that they've been doing for 10 years. So that's something that team pays attention to. And what they might do then is they may relay that back to someone like me to say, we've talked to 40% of Tumblr engineers and they really don't like this thing, right? And that way we can make changes. So I like that because it's a different mindset. It's also a different advocate, someone who's not directly tied to the team, who's a neutral party, but who wants to bring consistency and bring effectiveness everywhere. And it pays off when we want to switch people between teams. Because if you have a really, really different processes in different places or different tools, it's hard, right? You have to relearn a whole new stack or a whole new test tool or a whole new A/B testing system. And so that's where I think the broader view and some of that consistency comes into play for engineering management specifically. And yeah, it's been, that part of it has been very rewarding because we just have the scale now, right? Where we can try these things out and the sample size is bigger, right? And also some teams can opt out and say, we're heads down on this launch. Please don't make us come to any, like meta level meetings right now. We're just going to get this done, then we'll engage with you. So it's good for that rhythm as well.
Again, thank you so much. One thing I really liked about how you talked about, like, even in the context of moving from the traditional work environment to more remote, like how learning and relearning new skill sets and new ways to communicate is really, really important. Towards that, one question I have: how do you broadly think about growing people, upskilling people in a remote environment?
Mm-hmm. So it goes back to what I talked about, where you're paying attention to their personal details in the same way you pay attention to their career plan, right? Or their career ambition or what skills they want to learn. And we find this out during the interview, right? Or even if you know the people from the open source environment and you've been working with them on the tools before they're even an employee, you may already know some of this, what their ambitions are. One very common one that we hear on Tumblr is someone comes in as a mobile engineer and wants to learn web, or comes in as a web engineer and wants to learn, Android or iOS. And so we look for people who are looking for that full stack, right? I want to learn everything, even product management or data science, right? They can branch out in different directions. And in that case, we say very early on, we say, let's design, we call it PPM, personal professional mission, where it's a structured document where it talks about what would be really exciting for you in 5 years. What do you want to do in your career? And you work backward, just like you would a product plan, right? Or project plan, and look for milestones, look for challenges, look for opportunities to do it on the job rather than going out and getting the experience. Maybe you can do it right here, join this 2-week iteration. We also have hack weeks and other times during the year when people can kind of come out of their lane and do other things. And by the way, that's one way we discover new leaders and managers is we have them run a team during the hack week. And I always talk to them afterward and debrief and how did that go, And people, sometimes if it's their first time running a project, they say, wow, that was like herding cats. I never want to do that again. Please do not assign that to me. Other people say, wow, I like the responsibility and I enjoyed the ability to, have an opinion and be decisive. So we structure it with a career conversation with HR, with the team lead, again, with a mentor. We also have other programs. We have a coaching program. And one thing that's unique, or at least as far as I know, not that common about Automatic's coaching program is it's open to all employees. Even though it's executive coaching, it's open to everyone. And the only difference would be if you're a manager, you get maybe a few more sessions a year than if you're not a manager, but people can take advantage. And the goal there is to have a neutral, again, someone who's not a neutral party who's not part of the company, who is able to take an outside view and just talk, right? And extract lessons, extract insights, and have people bring those back to their work. One thing I did early in my career that was very effective was in that coaching environment, I learned how to be a self-coach, right? I learned how to take someone's advice and really expand on it in my own way. Like, so they give me the first step and I go to 2 to 10, right, on my own, then loop back and say, here's what I learned. I'm ready for the next hit. And so we encourage coaching. We also encourage team switching. And I mentioned this earlier around the consistent developer practices. So one way to advance or one way to grow would be to say, I would like a different challenge, right? It might be a different customer type. We have everything from enterprise to subscriptions, to advertising, to payments and commerce. So we have different types of software and products. And we also have, each team has their own culture, right, and different style within this broader set of teams. And so people can grow and reflect on that growth by saying, you know, I had this plan and my coach and my team lead and the other people in my environment were keeping me accountable. And here I am on the plan. I'm now, as I grow in my career, now I'm going to look for external, peers. I'm going to go to more conferences. I'm going to sign up for, a newsletter. Maybe I'll write a newsletter. So we do see quite a few different approaches here. But the thing that's important to me is that I don't think it really depends on the remote versus co-located, other than you have to be a little bit more intentional and structured, I think, when it's remote or distributed, because you don't naturally run into each other, right? So you might not be going out to the parking lot and see someone in the hallway and say, hey, could you have 5 minutes? You have to do that in a different way, right? So you might invite each other into a one-on-one, or in our case, we have these Slack integrations called Donut. I don't know if you're familiar with that bot, the Donut chats.
No, I am not.
So Donut is not, it's a separate company or a separate service, but you integrate it with Slack and you create a new channel, and anyone who's in that channel gets automatically paired with each other in these one-on-one conversations. And what I love about this, we have this for many different flavors of interactions. One is every new employee gets paired with anyone else who opts into that. We also have that within Tumblr, like social chat. And you don't have to talk about work in that case, right? It's just, hi, how are you? We wouldn't normally run into each other, so let's have time together. But say you're in this onboarding stage, you're a new developer, new engineer. We also might have a donut that's with other people going along that journey, or with other people who are in the same field, right? PHP, JavaScript, Golang, right? Whatever it is that you're learning or working on, cloud computing, things like that. And you would get these donut chats that prompt you, and you don't have to do anything. It ties into your calendar, it sets up the invite, and it has a few asynchronous questions to get the conversation going. And then you just show up. And so what's really nice about that is it replicates a little bit. I'm not going to say it's equal to, but it replicates a little bit of that serendipity of saying, I don't really know who else is doing this, but as long as I join this group, I will find out who they are. And we recently just started one for product managers, right? So we're just trying to create, connections organically throughout the company.
That's fantastic. That's almost like the water cooler conversation or the bumping into people that you're missing. Now you have tool for that. I really, really like that. We'll have to try that. You mentioned a lot about different types of tools, like you mentioned Slack and all these like incredible new like integrations that you can do there. I have like maybe a two-part question here related to that. Like one is like, what are the general tools that you have found useful to keep the team like successful in a remote first environment? And then secondly, one of the things that I have felt even in like a not only remote first environment, but even in like the in-office environment is like just like how synchronous methods of communication can sometimes overwhelm you. And like, especially like in some roles, like if you're a designer or an engineer, like you might want like that block of time to think. Like, how do you think about synchronous versus asynchronous modes of communication or tools? So tools in general, and then that thought in particular, I would love to pick your brain on.
Yes. On the tool side, some of them are pretty simple. We use Google products, so Google Calendar, Google Docs. One habit here is if you're in a meeting, something like this, right, where we're working on something together, we would have a Google Doc as well, often shared for everyone. And you're commenting, you're co-creating the document. As an example, say we're doing a request for comment, like an architectural decision or in engineering. someone might author it originally, but then you might do a call for comments, right? And some of it could be in a meeting, otherwise it could be asynchronous. But you have a shared artifact, and that artifact, which is a written document, can then be broadcast right into a different environment. And by having that, using that tool to its purpose, which is to gather information, gather comments, sharpen, remove errors, condense down to the meaning, you can really use it to its best effect. One tool I want to mention is Mural, M-U-R-A-L, that we use for whiteboard, online whiteboard. And this is really useful when you want to do Post-it notes and you're like a retrospective, or we have a habit that we call futurespective, where we describe an ideal state in the future and we work our way back. And you have each person does Post-it notes on the wall, right? If it's physical. Well, Mural makes it really easy. You just double click in the board and it creates a Post-it note, different colors and things. And you can publish it, right? You can export it as a PDF. We also use P2, the letter P as in Peter, and then the number 2, which is our own blogging and collaboration tool built on WordPress. And what that does for us is each team or project has a hub where they can post goals, plans. I mentioned earlier that Team OS, that would go on that P2. And you can cross link between them. And you can also mention people by name, in conversations. But the reason we're using P2 rather than say meetings or even Slack, P2 is effective in a couple of ways. One, we own the content, right? It belongs to, it's WordPress, so it's open, right? We can download it. It's not tied to some other company. The second thing is it's written communication rather than only verbal, right? So you can capture it and search it and tag it and archive it. And the third thing is that it does encourage this asynchronous habit, right? So let's think of synchronous versus asynchronous. So synchronous is about meetings. Asynchronous defaults more to that writing, right? Where you can consume on your own schedule or in your own format. In asynchronous, it's about time zone. Like we need to all get on at 9 a.m. San Francisco versus it doesn't really matter, what time you're working because you can consume this on your own time. There's real time versus deep work. And you mentioned that sometimes we need these chunks of time to really get our mind focused on something. I think especially on creative coding or writing or design, it's very, very important. And there's a famous essay by Paul Graham from Y Combinator years and years ago. He talked about maker versus manager. And it changed my life when I read that because it talked about how managers have 15-minute little slots on their calendar all day long because they're going into many, many different contexts. And a maker just has one slot of 4 hours, right? Everything is off. They're just in the zone. They're creative. They're going to their thing. So in an asynchronous environment, we want much more of those deep, chunks of time, and we want fewer of those interrupted times because it's just hard to get things done in that way. While acknowledging, of course, that there are still managers and there are all people who still need to be interrupted if it's an emergency, things like that. There's another key point here, which is we talk about burnout, we talk about mental health, we talk about people struggling with pressures at work. In my experience, asynchronous creates a much more calm and deliberate approach versus the need to be always on, right? 24/7, answering your phone. A little bit from a developer standpoint, it's like the on-call culture where your beeper or your phone could go off by your pillow, right? And interrupts your life. In an asynchronous world, especially if you have people around the globe, it's their day while I'm sleeping, right? So it's their 9 to 5. There's no one has to have their phone by their pillow. It's just they do it during their time. I do it during my time. And you have this kind of passing of the baton, right? Your turn, your turn, your turn, like shift work without someone who have to work the overnight shift, right? Unless they want to. But it's a little bit more flexible and a little bit more adaptive to their style. And lastly, I would say there's something that's very important about this written versus meetings, where if you aren't someone who's there or someone who's extroverted and goes to every event, or someone who is, again, willing to be up at 1 a.m., it's more inclusive because it levels the playing field of access to that information. And I think GitLab was one of the most transparent this way. They recorded their meetings and posted them. They had everything documented on their website. That's very admirable. And I think it's hard to do, but it's great. But the principle behind it is if you need access to information to get your job done, you shouldn't have to go through like a hierarchical chain or be ask for a meeting, you should be able to just literally search and just say, here's the words I'm looking for. There's the information, right? So it's accessible. It's always available, right? That's another key thing here. But I want to underline the cultural aspect of just a sense of calm, a sense of openness, a sense of breathing and time during your day versus this frantic, going from one thing to the next. You don't even have time to get a drink or eat your meal because you have meeting. And then if you're like people that I know, you do your work at 9, 10, 11 p.m. at night when you're tired, right? So it may not be the best time of your work. So I think this is an important topic. I also think that leaders need to role model this we can't just tell people, hey, be flexible. We actually have to set up the structures and in the culture and the deliberate approach that we do in our work as well. An example, I have this meme or joke with my teammates. If I ping them and it's not urgent and they say sorry if it's late, right? Like an hour later, I make them put a $1 into my sorry jar, right? You don't have to apologize when it's asynchronous. I expect you to answer when you're next available. And if I want to override that, I will tell you, this is urgent, SOS, 911, right? Like drop everything. If I don't say that, it could be tomorrow, right? And that's fine. And what ends up happening is you get this sense of thoughtfulness, you get a sense of really reading what someone is saying. One of the things I experienced in the frantic, real-time side is I'm so eager to kind of get to the answer that I'm not even reading what the person has, and you're already commenting on it, right? Without even reading the whole thing. In this deliberate approach, you're considering it, maybe you're reading it 2 or 3 times, and then you're typing, you're retyping, you're editing your answer, and you have a little bit more of a thoughtful approach to it. So let me pause there because I could go on for a lot longer.
No, I absolutely love this. This is really well connected with, and it's great to hear some examples of the thing that you mentioned earlier, which is like human side of leadership. So I really appreciate that. Talking about this human side and our our personal lives and stuff like that. One thing I also really appreciate about your story is that you're where you're located, you're also close to your parents and in-laws and family in general. That is amazing. Tell us more things about, like, as working remotely, what have been some of the pleasant surprises that you have encountered? That one was probably planned, but other things that you have found that you have been happy about, but did not expect as a perk of working remotely.
One thing is that it's not just work from home. I see this a lot on Twitter and on other social media where, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, people were struggling because they didn't have a good home office setup. They hadn't invested in lighting. They didn't have a good chair. They didn't have good ergonomics, right? Or maybe they just didn't have room. Many of my teammates on Tumblr were in small apartments in Manhattan, right? Where it's just one studio, like there's no bedroom. It's all one thing. And so one of the things that surprised me is the flexibility to create my own environment has been so crucial to productivity. And one example of this, before the pandemic, so 2018, 2019, I was commuting on purpose, right? I had a 20-minute commute by car to downtown Tucson because my wife had her company was co-located, but I would go with her. And I just rented an office in an old historic neighborhood, really aesthetic look to it. It was this old barrio, like this old Mexican neighborhood. And I just love the sensation of being there. That was enabled by the fact that I didn't have to be in a particularly physical location of my employer's choice. It was my choice, which could be the couch, right? It could be the backyard. We have teammates who are nomads who go month to month, different places. People who have RVs and just camp and go places. So the key thing here for me is that work from anywhere, right? Not work from home. And then also the flexibility to say, what's serving me now may not serve me when I become a manager. Maybe now I need to have a really good video set up because I'm on meetings. Let me pick a different place. Whereas before, maybe I was in coffee shops and it was loud, right? Or distracting. And so that flexibility is important to me. Another thing that's been just so amazing is these companies tend to attract people who are open and curious about other cultures, open and curious about other ways of working, simply because they've opted into this one, right? Which I think for some generations or even some people even today, it's weird or different, right? It's innovative or seems avant-garde to them. So you get other people who are joining that purposefully, and they say, how can we be even better, right? So all the things I've talked about today, we could probably interview one of my teammates and they would say, oh yeah, but you forgot, we're doing this other experiment. And so we're constantly evolving. I think we're on the forefront of the future of work. And I can't wait to see what's next, because whether it's going to be virtual reality, whether it's going to be some way that we can have regional hubs where your commute is, maybe one flight instead of around the world. I don't know what's next, but I'm really excited to see what the future holds.
Fantastic. Thank you again so much, Lance. First of all, I personally learned so many new things and tips and tricks here today from you. Really enjoyed all the answers that you gave to all the questions, and I'm sure all the viewers who would view this will also find it very, very useful. On top of it all, I think you have very infectious energy about yourself. This is sort of the end of the day, but you got me really pumped up right now. So I really, really appreciate your time and your thoughtful responses to everything that we discussed. Thank you again.
Thank you, Deepak, for having me.